In part 2 of our series on Hermeticism, we'll examine some of the core ideas, philosophies, and texts which comprise Hermetic thought and work our way toward an understanding of the Hermetic worldview. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. If you're just joining us, be sure to watch the first part of this series, What is Hermeticism, Part 1. As mentioned in that episode, a group of texts comprise the Hermetic thought of late antiquity, the Hermetica. Within the Hermetica is a smaller group of documents referred to as the Corpus Hermeticum. Within the larger Hermetica, there are two distinctions of text, the philosophical Hermetica and the technical Hermetica. We'll primarily be examining the philosophical Hermetica in this episode, and we'll only be considering the technical Hermetica briefly towards the end. We'll be considering some of the foremost principles put forth by the Hermetic texts by way of a few of their more well-known materials. We'll be looking at selections from the Emerald Tablet, from the Arabic Alchemical Hermetica. Please do not confuse this with the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. That text has literally nothing to do with Hermeticism other than an appropriation of the name. We'll also be looking at the Poimandros or Poimander. This word means the shepherd of men, and it is the first book of the Corpus Hermeticum. We'll also be looking at the Asclepius or Perfect Discourse of Hermes from the Corpus Hermeticum. There will be a few other selections from throughout the Corpus Hermeticum primarily, but we'll also be looking at a couple of the Stobaean extracts. One last caveat: to save time, I will not be mentioning any historical context surrounding any of these texts, which has already been covered in Part 1. So, definitely check it out. That said, let's dive in. While short, the Emerald Tablet is arguably the most well-known among the Hermetic literature. This enigmatic text gives a description imparting certain abstract keys by which to understand the processes of creative deity and nature. The correlation of significance here is to the idea that these are unified in some way. Nature is informed by the Absolute in her underlying existence. Let's have a look at some of the verbiage translated from the extant Arabic manuscript. It should be noted that since this was essentially appended to a medieval Perso-Arabic alchemical text, the Emerald Tablet is sometimes considered a part of the technical Hermetica as well. The first I'd like to have a look at is a translation by, believe it or not, Helena Blavatsky. The reason I begin with her translation is because what is arguably the most well-known Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, coming directly from this work, is translated as near to exact to the original, quote, "What is below is like that which is above, and what is above is similar to that which is below, to accomplish the wonders of the one thing. As all things were produced by the mediation of one being, so all things were produced from this one by adaptation. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon. It is the cause of all perfection throughout the whole earth. Its power is perfect if it is changed into earth. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, acting prudently and with judgment. Ascend with the greatest sagacity from earth to heaven, and unite together the power of things inferior and superior. Thus you will possess the light of the whole world, and all obscurity will fly away from you. This thing has more fortitude than fortitude itself, because it will overcome every subtle thing and penetrate every solid thing. By it, the world was formed." I'd also like to have a look at the translation of Sigismund Backstrom, the 18th century alchemical scholar and purported Rosicrucian initiate. "It is true, no lie, certain, and to be depended upon. The superior agrees with the inferior, and the inferior agrees with the superior, to effect that one truly wonderful work. As all things owe their existence to the will of the only one, so all things owe their origin to the one only thing. the most hidden by the arrangement of the only God. The father of that one only thing is the sun. Its mother is the moon. The wind carries it in its belly, but its nurse is a spirituous earth. That one only thing is the father of all things in the universe. Its power is perfect. After it has been united with a spirituous earth, separate that spirituous earth from the dense or crude by means of a gentle heat with much attention. In great measure, it ascends from the earth up to the heaven and descends again newborn on the earth, and the superior and the inferior are increased in power. This is the strength of all powers. With this thou wilt be able to overcome all things and transmute all what is fine and what is coarse. In this manner the world was created. The arrangements to follow this road are hidden. It is ended now what I have said concerning the effects of the sun. Now, I covered another translation of the Emerald Tablet and its application into the theory of alchemy in an episode entitled What is Alchemy? Part 2. So check that out. We see here essentially a formula for the revelation of what the text calls the, quote, one only thing. This formula involves certain luminary and planetary bodies, namely the sun, the moon, and the earth. It also, however, involves wind. From this we glimpse a fourfold elemental constituency. The sun, representing elemental fire, the moon, elemental water, for reasons which should be apparent, the earth as clearly elemental earth, and wind as the element of air. Throughout the history of Hermetism, we do in fact find alchemy emerging from a Hermetic root, again emphasizing a distinctly practical application of a hidden or encoded cosmological pattern. The line, quote, as above, so below, which is oftentimes further misquoted as going on to say, as within, so without, as the universe, so the soul, or some variation, actually reads more closely to Blavatsky's rendering of it. Here's a literal translation. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above. Nowhere in the Hermetica does it go on to say, as within, so without, as the universe, so the soul. This is the later interpolation, which is harmful to the analysis and comprehension of the text, grafted and imposed on an ancient Arabic Hermetic alchemical text, which, while perhaps alluding to a very new agey take on the doctrine of the microcosm and macrocosm, which wouldn't necessarily be incorrect in spirit, still fails to grasp the importance of the line as a basis for astrological magic, and the doctrine of sympathies and correspondences, which would become so important to the Renaissance magic of Agrippa and others. From here on in the text, we glimpse an operation of the famous alchemical axiom, solve et coagula, in the line, quote, separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross. We also see a circuit or circulation of this one thing. Quote, it ascends from the earth up to heaven and descends again, and the superior and inferior are united and increased with power. So here we have a clearly alchemical text, which we know from episode 1 it absolutely was. Yet it's not merely alchemical, it's also cosmological. It avers the monism or henotheism of the one only thing in denoting its movement in unison with the divine mind. Arriving at this concept of divine mind, we can look to the Poimandros or Pymander. From the Solomon van Ooyen Wharton translation, quote, who are you, said I. He said, I am Poimandros, the nous of the Supreme. I know what you wish, and I am with you everywhere. End quote. We've seen in previous episodes that the Greek word nous means mind, and it figured heavily in our discussion of Neoplatonic philosophy by way of Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus. The divine nous, mind, intellect, is the uniting and motive force behind the universal creation. We find nous in Neoplatonic philosophy to be tantamount to creative deity, the Platonic demiurge. It moves in unison with its creation, its will supervening and generating all causes. Interestingly, we find several points of confluence, perhaps an underlying worldview within Hermetism and Neoplatonism. We also find this in early Christian sects, particularly the schools of thought such as the Gnostics of the era. There is a unified terminology or jargon attributed to very distinct phenomena and philosophical conceptions. There is a unified cosmogony and cosmology throughout. Further, we read in the Copenhagen translation of Poimandros, quote, "What first gives rise to each person's body is the hateful darkness from which comes the watery nature, from which the body was constituted in the sensible cosmos, from which death drinks. Why is it that he who has understood himself advances toward God, as God's discourse has it? Because, I said, the Father of all things was constituted of light and life, and from him the man came to be. Man alone is double, mortal because of the body, immortal because of the real man. For although being immortal and having authority over all, he suffers mortal things which are subject to destiny. Although above the harmony of the cosmos, he has become a slave within it." Here again we find a deep consonance with Neoplatonic and Gnostic views, namely the soma sema paradigm, that wordplay utilized in the Platonic dialogues to describe the body as the prison of the soul, as well as the inherently consuming and confounding nature of hyli or matter on the incarnated soul. There's also a reference here to the quote-unquote Father of all things as being constituted of light. We find this analogy within Plato's allegory of the cave, where he likens the actual sun to what he terms τον agathon, the capital G good, contemplation of which leads the soul on to the remembrance of its divine heritage and a life of virtue, culminating in an integrated well-being of body, mind, and soul. Further, quote, "From the elements that way downwards, the word of God leapt straight up to the pure craftwork of nature, and united with the craftsman mind. To this Poimandros said, first, in releasing the material body, you give the body itself over to alteration, and the form that you used to have vanishes. To the daimon you give over your temperament, now inactive. Thence the human being rushes up through the cosmic framework, at the first zone surrendering the energy of increase and decrease, at the second, evil machination, a device now inactive, at the third, the illusion of longing, now inactive, at the fourth, the ruler's arrogance, now freed of excess, at the fifth, unholy presumption and daring recklessness, at the sixth, the evil impulses that come from wealth, now inactive, and at the seventh zone, the deceit that lies in ambush. And then, stripped of the effects of the cosmic framework, the human enters the region of the Ogdoad. He has his own proper power, and along with the blessed, he hymns the Father. We find here, in the Poimander, the Platonic, Neoplatonic cosmological schema of the 7 planetary spheres and the Ogdoad. The whole conception comes directly from Plato's myth of in Book 10 of the Republic, which we covered in detail in Episode 4, the myth of We find a cosmological schema of the planets imparting certain vices and virtues onto the incarnating soul. This was detailed by the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry, where he conceives of the incarnating soul as descending down from beyond the Ogdoad, under the guidance of its tutelary daimon, and upon arriving at each planetary sphere, taking on what he calls the accretions or astral garments. In the Poimander, we see them being divested after the death of the body. We also find words here such as daimon and craftsman, demiurge, right? Demiurgos, which are again drawn directly out of this section of Plato as a definitive and coherent cosmological terminology and narrative. We also find curious allusions to the earthbound soul being weighed down in a heavy elemental creation and then ascending upward to the divine and irrational. Perhaps an allusion to the separation of the subtle from the gross and an initial descent followed by an ascent, these having strong consonance with the formula expounded in the Emerald Tablet. Let's move to another brief consideration of the Asclepius, or the perfect discourse of Hermes. Here we find Hermes, pretty much tantamount to the divine nous in the Poimandros, giving a discourse to Asclepius and his son Tat. He begins by describing the orientation and nature of material creation and being. Quote, "Everything comes from heaven into earth, into water, into air. Only fire, which is born upwards, is life-giving. What moves downward serves it, yet what moves down from on high is full of generative power. What moves upward gives nourishment. Only earth, of all the elements, remains within itself and is the receiver of every kind of form, and what it receives, it returns." Again, we see a consonance with our quote-unquote emerald formula. We should point out that both the Asclepius or Perfect Discourse and the Poimandros predate the Emerald Tablet, according to current historical data, by between 600 and 800 years. Quote, "This therefore is the all, as you remember. It is the essence of the all, and it is the all. The soul and the cosmos, being embraced by nature, are set in movement by her, with such diversity of quality evident in all images, that countless forms are known to exist by the contrast of their qualities. Yet these forms are also united, so that all things appear as one whole, and from the one." The Asclepius speaks to the indwelling of the divine mind in nature, as well as the ecstasis, the outstanding of the divine mind from material nature. It emanates all, yet it has its own external existence without it, and to be sure, the physical cosmos does not generate mind, but the nous, the divine mind or intellect, precedes and generates all physicality. Further, in the 11th work from the Corpus Hermeticum, entitled Mind unto Hermes, a discourse between the divine mind and Hermes, we find the following. Quote, "And contemplate the multitude of deathless lives, how great it is, and that of lives subject to death, and midway between both. And all are full of soul, and all are moved by it, each in its proper way, some round the heaven, others around the earth." We see in this work and multiple other instances a conception of an ensouled cosmos. We find this idea in the Platonic dialogue, the Timaeus, where Plato refers to it via the titular Pythagorean philosopher Timaeus as the psyche cosmou, or soul of the cosmos. In the Renaissance Hermetic tradition, this later becomes translated in Latin as the anima mundi, or world soul. In the early Hermetic literature, however, we find this ensouled cosmos acting not upon its own will, but rather upon the will of the Father of the All, God, the divine mind. The word for this action is often the Greek logos, meaning rationality, order, plan, and or reason. Moving on to the fragments of Stobaeus, as translated and collated by M. David Litwa, we read the following in the first of these extracts. Quote, "Bodies are seen by eyes, and sights are spoken by the tongue. But what is bodiless, invisible, without shape, and not consisting of matter cannot be grasped by our senses. I have this insight, Tat. I have this insight. What cannot be expressed, this is God." This is referring, as the Poimandros did, to the apophatic nature of the Absolute. We find this espoused in Neoplatonic, particularly Platinian philosophy, and we also see it further down the line in the Kabbalistic idea of the three veils of negative existence. Further, from the third fragment of this collection, quote, "These are the kinds of souls, divine, human, and non-rational. The divine soul is the energy that propels its divine body. The human soul has a portion of the divine, yet non-rational elements, namely drive and desire, are attached to it. Drive and desire are also immortal, inasmuch as they are energies, the energies of mortal bodies. These energies are far from the divine part, when the soul inhabits the divine body. But when this divine part enters a mortal body, drive and desire travel round with it. With them present, a human soul is always the result." This echoes the nature and disposition of the human soul as elaborated in Plato's conception of the tripartite soul. We could examine easily 20 or 30 other works. This has been very far from exhaustive. Yet from it we can still derive, among the texts and the fragments we've very cursorily examined, certain consonances and cosmological, theological, and cosmogonical through lines, which are also extant in much of the broader Hermetic literature. So let's distill this down into some of the most salient principles. Hermetism, according to the Hermetica, avers The unity of the absolute. The highest conception of deity is conceived of as an unspeakable fullness from which everything comes forth. It is one, unified in itself, and all things are unified in it. The omnipresence and transcendence of deity. This divine presence exists within everything and is the motive cause behind everything according to its will and intellect. Yet it precedes all creation and therefore exists also outside of it, that is, having independent existence from it, whereas nothing in creation exists independently of God. An ancient truth embodied in teachings. This is something eminently Hermetic. The Platonic streams of thought were largely a philosophical process of working out the dilemmas of life and cosmology, despite whatever individual Platonic philosophers may have thought regarding the source of Platonic philosophy, whereas the Hermetic tradition avers a single truth permeating all reality, communicated in a series of divine teachings, imparted by a master or the divine nous itself to a disciple. It's interesting to note, however, that the Hermetic literature as well as the Platonic dialogues, not to mention the work of Iamblichus in On the Mysteries to some degree, take the form of discourses or exchanges between two or more persons wherein truth is dialectically revealed. A unified cosmology and ecstasis as a method of reception. We see that it shares in the basic model and vernacular of the ancient Greek Platonic Hellenistic cosmology, utilizing models such as the Ogdoad and the 7 planetary spheres, terms such as logos and daimon to describe the nature of and spiritual beings populating the cosmos along with humans. It delineates an emanative creation, particularly regarding the soul. The individual soul is not made ex nihilo, but is poured forth from God's own essence. On emanationism, I quote scholar and author Walter Hanegraaff. Quote, "Emanationism implied that human beings could return to God by attaining direct experiential knowledge of their own divine essence, by means of ecstatic states of mind, and this was equivalent to the quintessential Gnostic doctrine of auto-salvation by means of a salvational gnosis." End quote. So for transparency of context, Hanegraaff speaks here of emanation within a Platonic context. However, we also find this to be true with much of the Hermetic discourses, as the disciple, in many cases, seems to be conversing with a pedagogue or mystagogue, identifying themselves as or making some connection with nous, the divine mind. So, for example, take the following passage from the Hermetic Nag Hammadi text, Discourse on the 8th and 9th. Where the mystagogue called Father says to his disciple called Son, speaking of invocatory prayer to God, quote, "Your part then is to understand. My own is to be able to deliver the discourse from the fountain that flows to me. Lord, grant us truth in the image. Allow us through the Spirit to see the form of the image that has no deficiency and receive the reflection of the pleroma." After receiving this vision, the mystagogue continues, quote, "For already the power which is light is coming, for I see indescribable depths. How shall I tell you, my son? How shall I describe the universe? I am mind, and I see another mind. I see a fountain bubbling with life. I have said, my son, that I am mind. I have seen. Language is not able to reveal this." So what do we have here if not a description of ecstatic Gnostic revelation? Ecstatic obviously comes from the Greek word ekstasis, literally standing outside, but in religious rites, the connotation is out of body, out of the day-to-day consciousness we typically possess and refer to as the lowercase s self. Reincarnation or metempsychosis. Metempsychosis is the ancient Greek word for reincarnation, and a doctrine of reincarnation is espoused in Hermetism and Hermeticism. We read in the Hermetic texts, for example, quote, "O son, how many bodies have we to pass through? How many bands of diamonds? Through how many series of repetitions and cycles of the stars before we hasten to the one alone?" We find this attested in Plato's myth of as well. where the details of this process of metempsychosis are described at length. The existence of good and of evil. There is a definite duality of good and evil in the philosophy of Hermetism and Hermeticism, and the ideal to be striven after is the likeness of quote-unquote God the Father. The image of truth and capital G goodness is also here likened to the light. The fall of souls into generation. Hermetism and Hermeticism affirm that the soul, traversing the material realms, is among a foreign substance. Beautiful, perhaps, but all the more easy to become enamored by and ensnared within. This abounds in Hermetic literature. The working out of the cosmological and soteriological dilemmas are dealt with in alternately abstract and concise, definitive ways, much of which concerns the knowledge of an eternal truth and striving toward the divine by manner of contemplation and emulation. Again, we find here the Platonic doctrine of paideia, or the education of the soul by contemplation on the capital G good, likened to the sun in Plato's allegory of the cave. And we also find the path of arete, or virtue, excellence, as leading toward eudaimonia, well-being, or more literally translated, true daimon. It also delineates the nature and types of the soul, which it considers to be immortal and able of being perfected. Again from the Asclepius, or Perfect Discourse. Quote, "'Tis mind and reason, whole out of whole, all self-embracing, free from all body, from all error free, unsensible to body and untouchable, self stayed in self, containing all, preserving those that are, whose rays, to use a likeness, are good, truth, light beyond light, the archetype of soul." And from the Corpus Hermeticum text entitled The Key, quote, "For it is possible, my son, that a man's soul should be made like to God, even while it still is in a body, if it doth contemplate the beauty of the good." It is also noted that the soul can become altered by desire and experiences in the material of a markedly earthy type. Again from The Key, quote, "But if a soul, on entering the body of a man, persisteth in its vice, it neither tasteth deathlessness nor shareth in the good, but speeding back again, it turns into the path that leads to creeping things. This is the sentence of the vicious soul, and the soul's vice is ignorance. For that the soul who hath no knowledge of the things that are, or knowledge of their nature, or of good, is blinded by the body's passions and tossed about. This wretched soul, not knowing what she is, becomes the slave of bodies of strange form in sorry plight, bearing the body as a load, not as the ruler, but the ruled. This ignorance is the soul's vice." End quote. All of these ideas agree completely in the Platonic and Gnostic Christian philosophies regarding these things. They are consonant philosophies emerging from and out of one another. It is only later, particularly within Christian orthodoxy, that these things are attempted to be retroactively dismantled and the legs pretty much severed from the body upon which it stands. An idea I'd like to bring up in connection with Hermetic principles as delineated from the Hermetic literature itself. Creative deity as archetypal magician. One of the most interesting ideas proffered by Renaissance Hermeticism is the idea of creative deity as supreme magician. We see, particularly in later interpretations of Hermetic literature, God as a kind of magician. It was conceived that the formulas encoded into the universe by creative deity and its magical processes imbued the world with an underlying relationship which we conceptualize to be magic, which human beings were enabled to perceive and participate in to a greater or lesser extent. This is evident in the vast traditions of astrological, alchemical, and theurgic magic that emerge from this philosophy. In this conceptualization, which was eventually systematized by figures such as Ficino, Agrippa, and others, number, words, and letters contain immense magical potency. We see this in the culmination of talismanic magic by the use of magic squares in deriving appropriate sigils. Also by use of names to be written in specific alphabets such as Hebrew and Greek. We see a drawing by Giordano Bruno linking the sun by way of solar rays to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, themselves corresponding to certain numerical values. However, referring back to what we mentioned about strictly ancient Egyptian cosmological models in the first episode of this series, it's really not hard to see how this magical worldview of the universe really pervaded ancient Hermetic philosophy as well, as we do see allusion to in much of the literature of the philosophical Hermetica. In fact, as I just mentioned, we clearly see this reference being made by way of the technical Hermetica. I'd like to conclude this episode by briefly considering some of the technical Hermetica at this point. However, as mentioned earlier, several of these texts are so important to magic and the magical traditions, it's kind of what we're all about here, that they'll be getting their own episode in the future. Arguably of great significance within the technical Hermetica, we have the PGM, or Greek Magical Papyri, the Picatrix, the Liber Hermetis, or Book of Hermes, and the Myriogenosis. The Greek Magical Papyri utilizes all manner of ritual techniques and implements, but is significantly reliant upon words. These particular words, when spoken, are called the barbarous names of invocation. These are often extremely long sections of ritual wherein strange and sometimes hideous-sounding names are given, which are, let's say, spoken or intoned with certain emphasis. The inscription of words, names, and symbols also figure on things like phylacteries and magical circles. For talismanic, astrological-based magic, we look to the Picatrix, which is itself a collection and distillation of many volumes of Hermetic literature and teachings, and which uses astrological placements and correspondences along with specific designs like sigils in astrological talismanic magic. Much more can and will be said about the Picatrix in later episodes. The Liber Hermetis, or Book of Hermes, is a significant book of Hermetic astrology, used primarily for obtaining knowledge of spiritual matters. It contains Hellenistic and Neo-Pythagorean elements such as numerology and geometry, as well as a schema of planetary cipher. The book also contains a thorough study of a technique of Arabic astrology known as the lots or parts, as well as an examination of the fixed stars or constellations, and a utilization of different degrees of aspects. What's special about this book is that it lists the names and iconography of the decans, or the divisions of the ecliptic, into 36 groupings of 10-degree segments. Now, this was a specifically Egyptian contribution to the astrology of the era. Finally, we have the book of Asclepius called Myriogenosis. This manuscript details the scheme of ancient astrological medicine. It is especially interesting to our study because of its examination of the various correspondences between the microcosm, or the individual human, and the macrocosm, or greater universe, by way of the construction of a natal chart as diagnostic tool. This falls into an ancient scientific category of iatromathematica, or medical mathematics. So much can and will be said concerning the Hermetic literature as we continue to work our way through the foundational tenets, philosophies, and practices of the Western esoteric traditions. So, which are your favorite Hermetic texts? What forms of Hermetic magic would you like to see covered in future episodes? Can you believe I didn't mention the Kybalion? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can help me continue to produce free, rigorously researched and practiced material like this. Patreon members also have access to bonus content, including episode addendums and my Egypt travel vlog, as well as other goodies. Please continue to watch, like, comment, and share if you're not in the position to contribute financially. There are always plenty of ways to help me keep the Arcanum channel alive and well. Join me again in the next episode where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other related topics. Thanks for watching. In Luke's.